This all ended with a facility condition index, with 0 being an uninhabitable structure and 10 being a brand new structure that's entirely code compliant. And where certain of our facilities landed on that index. So you'll see there at the top, 2 of our facilities, the Public Works Service Center and the Central Fire Station, were below 5, below that midpoint. Or excuse me, 3, including City Hall, the court, municipal court, and the police building, this building. And we had 2 that fell above that threshold, the 7 and 8 would be admin services building and fire station number 2, those being 2 of our newer facilities. So in that assessment, we were provided cost estimates for those structures, replacement structures would be. So these are the cost estimates in square footage based on standalone facilities. So what we don't have is what combination of facilities that we would be looking at in the future. Granted, our proposal and recommendation wouldn't be to have separate structures for each of these operations. We'd be looking at consolidating and where we can eliminate sort of duplicative spaces, training rooms, break rooms, things like that, that can be combined into one, and what makes sense, which operations to move and house together. So the 2019 estimates for all of these facilities was between $61 and $74 million. For the purpose of this presentation, we kind of went with the middle of the road. And I think what you'll see repeated through the presentation is about a $66.5 million estimate for a combined facility. And that's all I have right now on facilities, so I'll pause if there are any questions about that, and if not, I'll jump into the next.
Is the court system under City Hall in these estimates?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, and in this would, the City Hall facility would be City Hall, court, council chambers, from all of the facilities that are in here now, with the exception of the police department. So I'm going to jump into operating needs. So departments identified the following operating needs: staff, equipment, software, training, recruitment and retention tools, programs, and succession planning. I'm only going to focus on the ones that we could identify a hard cost associated with. So this table provides you cost estimates for the 96 staff members. So broken down by the funds that the staff members would fall into. This only includes salaries and benefits based on an average of where we are today. So if these individuals were all hired right now within our current salary structure, where they would fall. So the general fund would have an estimated $7.15 million in additional personnel costs. The enterprise fund would have about $1.69 million, and the hot fund would have about $78,000 in additional personnel costs. Those are big numbers, but I want to put them in perspective. Currently, the general fund's personnel budget is $19.9 million. So that $7.15 million represents a 36% increase in staff costs. For the enterprise fund, that $1.69 million represents a 54% increase in staff. So excuse me, I didn't want to make sure that this also factors in a 5% growth factor. So based on where we are today, if they weren't hired into year 5, we went ahead and projected that salary being 5% higher than it is now. We thought that was a conservative assumption moving that forward. It also does not take into account any increase in benefit costs. It is based off of our benefit costs as they exist today. So in terms of operating needs and equipment and resources, again, broken down by funds and departments, based off of the average of what we're seeing now in terms of purchasing equipment for new personnel, in terms of providing training for existing personnel, or adding any additional software or equipment that was identified by the departments. So this doesn't take into account any additional costs that would be associated with current personnel. These were the only costs associated with additional personnel. But we'd be looking at about $1.5 million more on the general fund in terms of operating resource needs, a little small amount in the court security funds, about $200,000 in the enterprise fund, and $50,000 in the hot fund. Most of these would be recurring expenditures. So these were things that if they were added in year 1 of the 5 years, they would occur every year thereafter. move on to planning needs. So in terms of planning needs, the departments, we really asked them to identify what strategic plans, master plans, or studies that were needed to prioritize their work over the next 5 years. And so they identified the list that you see on the screen. And while all these plans serve a different purpose, they really represent the conceptual layout for what guides work in terms of Tomball's built environment, as well as the systems and networks of assets and infrastructure that the city maintains. They help us make that connection really between the staff level operation work, the built environment, the capital needs, and community values. So all of these will include analysis, recommendations, and proposals based on their assessments. And they're important for a number of reasons, and I could go into any number one of these and give you a long explanation of why we do it. But really, these documents become the guidebook for how staff implements work. So if you've seen the wastewater master plan or the water master plan, it identifies what projects we need to do. And those become the initial discussions and conversations that we have at the staff level when we're recommending a project or a major expenditure accounts. So these are incredibly important and valuable. And we use them really in carrying out our day-to-day operations. So I do apologize, this is very tiny, but what I wanted to help council kind of visualize is about how much it costs to go through those planning processes. So based on the plans that we've currently identified, it's about 1.26 million in planning expenditures. And these often get classified as one-time expenditures, but they're not really one-time expenditures. They actually occur pretty cyclically. And so what I also add is the frequency at which these occur. So an example would be things like our comprehensive plan. So the complete comprehensive planning process usually occurs every 10 to 15 years within a community, depending on how fast that community is growing. With updates occurring maybe every 5 to 7 years. In a fast growing city, it's very typical to go through that update process every 3 to 5 years, which means you could be looking at an annual expenditure every 3 years of about $150,000 to update that plan. Jump into capital needs real quick. All right, as I mentioned before, these are the high cost items. They have long useful life of more than 3 years. They're going to include facilities, but we've separated that out. Furniture and fixtures, vehicles and associated outfitting, machinery and equipment, and infrastructure. And what I will remind council is that as part of the presentations, we ask staff to provide those cost estimates when they're available. One thing to keep in mind is that the anticipated economic environment could greatly influence the cost of capital. We're continuing to see prices go up and sort of year over year. I know we've provided council some of that inflationary costs and some of those construction material estimates, but they're significant. They're not 5 to 7% like we're seeing in some retail goods. They're 20 and 30% increases in costs. And then second is that the planning needs that we talked about in the section before actually will identify the additional capital needs that need to go forward. So you'll see some to be determined numbers in our capital section. So the capital needs that were identified by the departments in terms of equipment and vehicles total about $4.9 million. Now, again, this is tied directly to sometimes into the increase in staff. So vehicles, we wouldn't purchase a vehicle if we didn't hire the staff or the crew that needed the vehicle. Some of these vehicles are required now. They're replacements of fire apparatus, things like that, or new fire apparatus for a new station. So some of these are tied directly to the growth and staff, and some are items that we've identified as being key needs today.
Hey, Jessica, I'm in favor of replacing the election equipment. Just saying.
Noted.
And on the election, don't we have certain time limit if we order it before a certain date on the paper that we can get reimbursed from the federal government or the state government on that?
No, we don't fall under the guidelines.
We don't fall under the guidelines for paper filing?
We don't fall under the guidelines for size of city. And equipment, we bought our equipment before the deadline that they provided. We bought our equipment in 2010. And the reimbursement begins for equipment that was bought in 2015 or 16.
I thought it had to be audited by November in order to switch elections to all paper filing.
Oh, and it's not the order date. It's the reimbursement is tied to when cities bought the equipment. And I guess they're figuring if you bought it within the last 5 to 6 years, you haven't gotten your full life out of it. So they're going to help you recover your costs. But we bought ours in 2010, so we've gotten our full life out of it.
Okay,
So we don't qualify for reimbursement.
so we still have to switch to paper filing, but
We still have
We
to,
have to pay for
we
it.
still have to go to the new equipment. We will not qualify for reimbursement.
thank you.
Okay, this is going to be the very long list of infrastructure needs, and as I mentioned, the master plans are how we get to a lot of these projects, and that's why they're so important. So what you see there are the identified water and wastewater needs. These are all identified as part of the water and wastewater master plans, and that's why those plans are so important. These are the key things that we're doing to address growth, to address system expansions, and as you saw in the public works presentation, there's some pretty significant expenditures in there. The highest being the 1.5 million gallon expansion of the south wastewater treatment plant. This is the continuation of the list because I promised I couldn't have read it if it was any smaller on one slide. So this is inclusive of parks, the multi-department improvements, so things where there's multiple departments participating in a capital project, sidewalks and drainage. Altogether, as it exists right now, we've identified $130 million in needed capital expenditures over the next 5 years. The caveat, which is the big red box, so I wouldn't forget this, is it does not include projects that would be identified in a master planning process, such as the gas master plan, the drainage master plan, a parks master plan, or any additional street improvements or street constructions that would be needed as identified in the major thoroughfare plan. So that number is the best estimate we can do right now until we go through those planning processes. All right, I'm going to jump into the fun part of the presentation. So I'm not an artistic person, but I wanted to kind of try and visualize what these conversations felt like as we were having them. So here's what it felt like. As we were going through this, we talked about what's driving our changes. And we identified growing population, new development, and aging infrastructure. And what did all of that lead to? And really, as we talked through with the staff, what we found was, well, we need to improve our processes, or we need additional investments in infrastructure. Okay, but then we need more maintenance staff, but then we need to invest more in the facilities. Well, we need a plan to tell us what we need to build. And so we kind of kept having these circular conversations. So I thought it was just a fun way to show what these conversations really look like, and really what David and mine's day is really what it looks like almost every day when we're having those conversations. So big picture summary. Getting back to kind of where we started. The city is going to have tremendous growth, and it's going to put pressure on city operations and infrastructure over the next 5 years. We're going to need more people and resources and improved and expanded facilities to meet the demands. We've got to improve infrastructure and update aging infrastructure to accommodate growth. We need to appropriately plan for growth and prioritize those infrastructure improvements where they're going to have the biggest impact and where they're the most critical. We have to remain competitive in attracting high quality candidates for positions. As you can tell, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we need the best people involved in making sure that Tomball is achieving the vision. And the city needs to explore all options to maintain or improve services while remaining fiscally balanced. So with that, a clear vision and articulated set of priorities will help staff identify tools that are available to address the challenges facing the city, which is where council comes in. When we start talking about how do we translate everything that we're seeing and confronting into a strategic plan that's where we're gonna need council to help us identify those priorities. So keep that in mind as we go through this set of slides here, because that's gonna be where we come back to at the end. So here is one slide. So you have lots of tables in the first part of the presentation. Here's a table to summarize all of the tables. So what do those numbers look like all together? So 66.5 million in facilities, an additional 12.4 million in operating costs, an additional 1.26 million that has to be spent on plans that could generate additional investments in infrastructure. About 5 million in vehicles and equipments that are needed in the next 5 years, and 130 million in already identified capital expenditures. So all of those, like I said, very big numbers, very significant, and really it's going to fall on us to prioritize and find ways to fund these. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So facilities. So first and foremost, identifying new and expanded facilities at the cost of 66.5 million. Facilities are usually funded through debt by municipalities because they're expensive. You want to finance the cost over the life of the asset. Usually municipalities don't have enough cash on hand to do pay-go financing for these types of facilities. And you can really structure debt to meet cash flow needs. So looking and projecting growth into the future, you're able to align your debt to meet that. And then also one of the unique things about facilities is a lot of communities are looking at public-private partnerships to help offset the cost of those assets. What can be done to engage the private sector in helping to fund public amenities? So what are the two options that council really has here? One is certificates of obligation and two is general obligation. They're both forms of debt. They're both full faith and credit forms of debt of the city. The difference being that general obligation does require voter approval. Certificates of obligation do not. However, they have a different definition of debt under the tax code. And there are certain limitations of what you can use certificates of obligation for. In terms of how you implement moving forward is that you do need facilities that are operational in the next 5 years, which means there is a sense of urgency to addressing the facility needs, and that interim improvements or temporary facilities could be needed while larger facilities are being constructed. And the last point on implementation is that because a GO bond issuance requires creation of a bond committee and calling of an election, there is a much longer lead time into going into a GO debt issuance process. In terms of meeting operating needs,
Can I ask, when was the last time we issued a GO bond?
Certificate of obligation.
the GO? Did we have a bond election?
We have not had a bond election since the early 70s or 80s, I believe.
Most of our debt, because of the size of the city with BCOs, in 2019, the law changed the definition of debt under the tax code, which has led to a lot of cities switching to more GO debt issuance and bond financing, in the GO bond financing. So in terms of operating needs, really what the key here is that because they're operating needs, they're going to get prioritized through the budget process. You're going to see a lot of the operating needs that we've identified here submitted as supplementals in the FY23 budget. The 5-year forecast will provide insight into how much we're able to absorb based on growth in those operating capacities. And so our options here are to really work through that absorption through M&O. A high growth city, we're seeing a lot of development. We're going to have growth on our M&O side. So how much can we really absorb each year? And the second part of that is, like I said at the beginning, is really looking at our rates and fees and revenue structures, making sure that we're going through all of our cost allocation models. So where there is a function of the city that collects a revenue, say like community development, is making sure that our fees are covering the costs of that operation, tying that revenue source to that operation to make sure that development is paying for development and it's not being subsidized by additional taxpayers or rates or things like that. Also working through the revenues, rates, and fees set by council, and really making sure that we're tying them to the priorities as council identifies in a strategic planning process. In terms of planning needs, we often talk about these as one-time or limited multi-year costs. As I mentioned, when you're in a high growth environment, you might actually see these costs come up more frequently. They're typically going to be cash funded though, and they're going to be submitted as supplementals. So they're going to get absorbed into your M&O operations as well, or they're going to be cash funded through reserves when they're a true one-time expense. So what we're working through right now on the staff side is a way to amortize the cost of plans and associated timelines, so that we're not hitting council with this, well, we need $500,000 every 3 years, but we're not thinking about that in years 2 and 3. We're going to amortize that cost out so that when time comes to use that, to need that plan, that we've already set aside funding for that plan. We know those costs are coming, so we can do better to plan for those. And so again, the options here are cash funding or absorption through population and development-based revenue growth. But our goal is to really focus on that amortization and planning our plans, if that makes sense. In terms of implementation, many of the plans that are identified are needed as soon as possible, really because they're going to identify what those capital investments need to be. And so if council did want to pursue some sort of debt issuance for capital, we need to know the true number of debt that we need to look at moving forward. Capital needs, and again, I apologize, this is very tiny again, but 130 million in identified capital needs today. These are going to be the largest expenditures that facing the city in the near term. And paying for capital needs is going to require a multifaceted approach where we prioritize projects, we complete and update the appropriate plans, and we evaluate any funding option that's available to us. So for capital needs, we have a couple more levers we can pull in terms of funding. First and foremost being debt issuance, either through a CO or a GO bond. Looking at our impact fee assessments and making sure that projects that are identified as impact fee eligible are being appropriately funded through our impact fees. We're going to look at our rate structures and our adopted rates to make sure that we're aligning any additional costs into our rate structure and that we're forecasting out into the future. And then looking again at our general development fees, is development paying for development? So in terms of implementation, you will see a number of the capital needs identified in the FY23 proposed budget because they are immediate, and many capital needs require multi-year implementation. So even if we were to adopt a project in the FY23 budget, it may be FY24 or even FY25 before we realize that asset. Development of a more comprehensive CIP is going to be our priority, where we take a look at our master plans and develop a more cohesive CIP that'll guide staff in moving forward and help us align our debt structure, if that's a path council wants to choose with those projects. And then having additional discussions with our financial advisors to determine what would be our bonding capacity and potential funding structures. We've already initiated those conversations, but obviously before we move any further, we want to make sure we have the direction from city council that that's something you'd like us to pursue. So here's a handy little chart that summarizes everything that I just told you of what levers we have to pull in terms of a city and what funding mechanisms are available to us. Obviously, in terms of operating needs, we're looking at absorbing them into our M&O operations, cash funding, utility rates, updating our cost allocation models, and pursuing any fee adjustments, planning needs, M&O, cash funding, and utility rates. Facilities, we're looking at some M&O absorption. It will be small, usually when we're talking about additional costs that might be associated with upkeep or things like that. Cash funding what we can, using utility rates if we can for small pieces of that. But really COs and GOs being our largest chunk of facility needs, and the same for capital needs. Pulling every lever we can, but the primary focus being COs and GOs there. So I said all of that to say this. What are we going to do about all of this? And what can we do? So in terms of council, With all of this information, we hope to empower you as we go into our strategic planning process to help us set clear priorities of what's important and what will be the vision for council over the next 5 years. You'll see a lot of these things come up in budget meetings when we're talking about those year one things that we've already identified as must-haves we've got to move forward on. What staff is doing over the next month or two is really working on those cost allocation models. We're working on one right now with community development, also looking at our fee reviews, going through our master fee schedule, making sure that we dotted all our I's, crossed all our T's, and that we're staying within market, but also being aggressive and making sure that our fees are appropriate. We're going to go through our 5-year forecast and then also exploring what is the city's current debt capacity with our financial advisors. I believe that is all I have. Stop there.
Jessica, has these been sent to council to their emails?
Not yet, because I finished it about 3 o'clock today.
Okay. All right. So you'll send it out so
Yes.
everybody will be able to access it and study it
Yes.
as they need.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Questions?
Some of the personnel in the police department, I know we've been talking about SRO officers. And with, unfortunately, the situation that happened in Uvalde, I wonder what's going to happen in the future with the state, any future requirements in the school district. And that may be an area that we want to revisit, because I don't know what the requirements are going to be. And it may be something that the school district wants to implement their own instead of us. So that's one area. In reference to City Hall, one thing we may want to do is visit with the school district, because with their purchase of the old Baker Hughes or BJ Services facility, they may have plans in the upcoming years, and maybe not too far out, to vacate this facility over here. And if so, that may be an area that we could look at moving into. But I don't have any specifics.
Right. No. And so then those are great options for us. And again, this high level based to trying to give you the magnitude of what we potentially could look at. But absolutely, we should look at all of the options available. That's why we included the private-public partnerships, because there's abilities for some of the private to fund some of this stuff, and then we go back with a lease purchase or some type of agreement that will absolutely minimize the impact to both sides, M&O and into the debt service side.
Yeah, and I don't know what type of construction we were looking at some of the buildings, but some of them we may want to look at metal buildings with stone facades or whatever, which would be a lower cost type of construction than a brick structure. So those things are options that I think we need to consider as well for some of our facilities.
Have we looked at repurposing existing structures that are for sale in the city, large structures that are for sale, and repurpose, how much that costs versus new construction?
I can tell you that at least from when we've started the facility needs assessments, we've looked at a couple of potential sites. And while there's a lot of them that have a lot of pros, you've got to weigh that with the cons to it about making it fit the function. So instead of having and trying to force fit our functions into a pre-existing building, we would want to modify those. And then when you take the look at the cost or that it takes to do that, you end up looking at, you might be better off just looking at a site, or razzing if it truly is the site that you want. But we haven't gone into any detail about, is that an option yet? We just haven't. We've done brush overlooks and looked at it, and there are some sites that it could make sense.
Okay. Also a question, growth development is great, but if you can't flush the commodes, what difference does that make? So how much capacity do we have in our water and our sewage treatment plant? A 75% number was thrown out during the budget meetings that with all the development that we have platted that will go online by the end of next year, we would be at a 75% capacity in our sewage treatment. Is that still accurate? So it seems like infrastructure should be moved up because you can't bring in development or growth if you don't have the water, the sewage, the gas. I know there's some subdivisions that have complained that the water is discolored, and we need to find out what that is. So Tomball Hills has complained about that a lot, brown water. Don't know where that comes from. But I heard
Typically, if they have
several.
those complaints, they just need to just call and we send out and we do the flushing. I mean, that's just ongoing maintenance. It's not
Okay.
particularly capacity related, but you're right. But the thing is that, and what we tried to show is that it is a snowball effect. And so if we absolutely provide the capacity for development comes, population increases, our response. And so the priority on these things are almost all together. And so that's kind of the message that we're saying is there's not really one thing that really stands out as we've got to do this, and that's really the only thing, because that does tie into like Jessica's graphic there, that it is pretty much tied. And so while we had probably time in the past to kick some things down the road, we're getting close to that. Luxury is almost not there anymore.
Are we still at the 75% capacity with existing construction?
With the planned construction that we looked at, we had projected that we could hit that 75% mark, because that's a critical
Right.
piece for us, because at that point we have to start the design on expansion for the wastewater plant.
That's still the end of 23 with Lovett Industries coming on board and.
No, it
all the-
wasn't just Love It, it was that and plus all the
All
other
the
planned
subdivisions.
areas. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I was gonna comment, when we did the tour of the facilities, that was 2019, right? And we got a big report and we put it on the shelf, which is common, right? We have that, it's just hard to do all this stuff. So I think it was good to get the tour because I didn't really understand, how much we need to do. But the number just shocked us. Like nobody knew I don't think I knew what to do with the number. I didn't see a solution. I took the tour. And so part of this probably, and I get to just point at city council now, which is great, but there's been a resistance to take on debt, specifically, Councilman Townsend. And, I always felt like, and I didn't feel strongly enough about it. So hindsight's 20/20 on my part too, but we kind of missed the boat to take on debt. It was cheap and we just kind of missed it. And I don't know, I don't think we've still missed it. Rates are still, relatively low, even though they seem high. And I would encourage, the new council to consider, if you guys decide to take on debt, then some of these answers will start coming into play. If to me, if you look at it, council doesn't decide to take on debt, the answers look really different. So I would just encourage everybody to think about that. Because to me, that's kind of the first piece is how much money is there to play with? Because we got 140 million up there. I don't even know where to start. But if we had 40 or 50 million in the queue of various funding sources, now you can start saying, what are we really going to do and how quickly can we do it? I think, again, part of that is the decision to take on debt.
That's the important thing for them to do now is to create a revenue cash flow that we can look at. This is the sources of revenue. This is the debt capacity that we have in the system right now, based on the split between M&O and debt service rates. Can we adjust that? I know it was adjusted this last year. Can we adjust it back to where a little bit more maybe goes into debt service? If we don't try to fund capital type of projects out of our operating cash flow, that's an impact also. That might be a way to make it work a little bit better.
Have we checked or we can borrow money at with the rising interest rates right now? I know we still have a AA plus, we don't have a AAA yet. But we have a AA plus bond rating. Used to be 2%, but do we know what it is now? Is Kath?
Catherine's actually at the GFOA conference.
Okay.
So I don't know the number off. the top of
Okay.
my head.
All right.
It is still up to Councilman Beck. It's still very low in comparison to where it's been in the past. It's not as low as it was probably in 2019,
Mhm.
based on recent movements of the Fed, but it's still low. And especially for highly secured borrowers like municipalities.
With a reduction in property taxes on the constitutional amendments, have she done any projections about how that's going to affect us? Or has the valuations been so high, it really isn't going to affect us?
It does affect us because
Okay.
if you remember last year, we did adjust the tax rate. It was adjusted down to ensure that we didn't collect more than what we did prior year. We adopted the de minimis rate, which allowed us to bring in $500,000 more.
Mhm.
And so that cap does affect us. It limits our revenue stream to the expenditures. We have to make sure that our cash flow is matching up. So the way we're looking at it is that we're separating what's truly capital that can be funded by all those other various things, fees and debt and things like that versus true operational every year costs that that's what we're considering the base budget needs, that M&O side of the tax rate needs to absolutely fund. We cannot be upside down on that side. And then on the other side, we're looking at developing a program to where it's possibly a rolling debt program to where we don't need the $130 million all up front. We need to issue what we can build right now in the next 3 to 4 years, get that issued, get that built, and then do another issuance. And then it's going to be a rolling thing. It allows our tax base to grow, to be able to pay for that additional debt service once that hits in the next times. And then we will look at the financial forecast to see if we need to backload some of that to even further make sure that the new development pays for it. But I think it's true. We need to make that step. Councilman Diggs, you challenged us as staff and said, put pressure. We don't sugarcoat it, put it all on the table. And then that's kind of what we try to do is absolutely put what we're facing. And of course, we don't want to come off as the sky's falling either. It's just that those are truly the numbers. And so, but there's a way to handle it. We can do it, and it's going to be a measured approach. This is everything on the table. And that doesn't mean we have to do every single bit of piece of this.
We're also, you just paid $5 a gallon for gasoline. That just did. And they're expecting that to go up more. And as that goes up, mortgage rates go up, there's less discretionary income to spend on stuff for sales tax. So as we do our budget this year, we need to keep that in mind, that we've had great sales tax because of all the things we have going on in Tomball. But if there is a reduction in sales tax because of a reduction in discretionary income people have to spend, we need to have our budget of this is what we have to do, this is what we'd like to do.
Correct. And you're right.
So
And
we
that's-
know where we need to cut in going through this. And bond debt is not something once it's started that you end. So, but infrastructure is important. You're right. Your little diagram is just perfect. Yeah.
You can start having those conversations, you find yourself and you look at one of these, you feel like you're in that, like with this and then that, so.
Right. Okay.
One other thing, and I told David, 2 or 3 months ago that I would bring this up, but this inflation, the beneficiaries of this inflation are governments, first and foremost. We're seeing it. What are our numbers up? 30% in sales tax? 20%. And then the real estate number, which, all of it is just going skyrocket. I mean, my business properties went up 40% in 1 year. There's no 10% cap on all that. You just get the bill and figure out how to pay for it later. People are going to be sensitive to this, and there's a certain amount of money that's coming in that's our actual growth. And then there's an inflationary part, and, setting aside the needs that were just described, I really challenged David to identify, we may have all this money come in. How much of that is inflationary? Because I think we should consider giving that back on the property tax base. Because it's not necessarily more people or more sales or whatever, it's just inflationary. The treasury right now is flush with cash, more than ever in the federal government. And it's this inflationary environment. But individuals, I mean, who's getting a 20% raise right now in their cash flow at home? None of us, we're not getting the raises and our costs are going up. We're all getting squeezed, and people are going to be sensitive in ways we can't yet predict. And that's my message. It needs to be thought about. Is there room for property tax rate relief, even though our numbers are going up? And I think y'all should consider that. And maybe there's no room for it, but I would really challenge that thought.
David, didn't the de minimis rate actually reduce our property tax? I mean, the state through SB2 has done just what you're asking it to do.
Right. But it went down by a teeny tiny, ever small, unnoticeable.
It went down by a teeny tiny amount, but did the actual increase in property tax cover what the increase in the cost of doing business for the city was?
Agreed, but we've seen our houses go up, up 30% a year, right?
Right.
So we're going to get those corrections in 1 year that they can do. We can get to 10% year over year. Some people are already in it. I'm just saying that I think we need to be careful about how people are going to react at some point, right? When gas prices get that high, all these prices, they see their home values go up. They're getting no relief anywhere. Could be a challenge, right?
When you go put your credit card in and it maxes out,
Mm-hmm.
it limits out on the gas pump for your tank full, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt, there are going to be challenges that we're all going to have to face. And how we get there, it will be interesting to see.
Maybe we could start an estate planning program where people leave us money in their wills.
How about a GoFundMe account?
Go fund me. No,
We're
That's
gonna
okay.
get as creative as we can.
okay.
Legally.
Good caveat, yes.
I mean, Jessica, I think you did a good presentation. You put it all out there. I think there are some good options for us to choose from. Yes, we as council will have some major decisions that we have to make. And they're going to be costly decisions, but I think it's finally caught up to us that we need to make these decisions where, hindsight's always 2020. We maybe should have started working, because I do agree with you, Councilman Deggs. We should have probably issued some debt previously where we somewhat held off.
We couldn't see it coming. I mean, it was kind of.
No,
it was a little bit of a gut feel, but
we didn't see the big growth come, but we saw some needs in some of our facilities in that we should have probably jumped on sooner.
and I think I'm trying to remember the EDC numbers, but it's like 400,000 a year will give us how much to, I think we did maybe 500,000 for $8 million. 500,000, 20 years will give you $8 million. If those are does that make sense?
for the debt service.
500.
I remember discussing it over.
I mean,
How much debt service per year will generate how much, what's our capacity? And I think we were looking at a $14 million issuance resulted in about 250. I don't remember.
I don't
Yeah,
remember.
1.8.
There's lots of variables that we can look at. One thing to keep in mind if you're in a group environment, what you might want to do is align your debt structure to match your growth. So you're
Yeah.
not front ending your debt, you're increasing your debt service as you go, so that you're kind of growing into it to keep it more level as opposed to a level debt service where you'd say, okay, a penny gets us this much, so we're gonna factor that in over time. So there's lots of options even in the debt arena that we can kind of play with and look at what is our growth and what can we grow into to make that very manageable moving forward.
And EDC will have their, I think it's their debt, the second, they'll have increased debt limits because they're paying one of them off by the end of the year on that. So we can associate with our partners too, to all be on the same page, helping each other. Okay.
Good thing is we don't have a whole lot of debt.
No, we don't.
All right, so the next, moving forward, then we'll work on scheduling the strategic planning sessions, because I think this one will dive into a lot of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Any other questions on anything? Okay, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Thank you. We stand adjourned.
That's right.